Okay. Let me ask you one more last question. How, in your experience, is inflation beneficial to a person who's doing a acquisition? I'm just saying is that just say if inflation, and just being a devil's advocate here, goes up, just say at a certain level, how can we as business buyers use inflation as an asset to the business acquisition process? Is that even possible? I know you got a lot of experience. You've seen many different business cycles throughout your tenure, for as doing what you've been doing. So, I mean, how does that play a role, or how can we leverage or maximize in that type of environment?
Okay. Here's where inflation actually has its advantages for an acquirer of a business. Okay. There are two things, first of all, though, that go together. Okay. High inflation and high money cost. Okay. So
Okay.
you can't separate them. The two of them are inextricably connected. All right. They're connected. So as inflation goes up, so does the cost of money. However, there are certain money costs that don't go up that much. Okay. And let me give you an example of what they are. If I borrow from a bank, I'm going to be penalized by inflation. Okay. If I borrow from an asset-based lender, I'm going to be penalized by inflation, higher interest costs. Where the higher interest costs don't really happen is in the seller financing. And as financing gets restricted by inflation because it's harder to borrow money, seller financing becomes a bigger piece of the acquisition price. So in a low inflation market where money is abundant and not very expensive, sometimes the sellers will end up not financing any portion of it, or maybe 10% of the purchase price. But when money is really constricted and really expensive, and they can't sell their business without a lot of seller financing, they'll take sometimes 50, 60% seller financing, maybe sometimes even more, depending on how hard it is to sell their business. And in a non-inflationary world, those interests on those notes to the seller are usually around 4 or 5%. In the inflation environment, they're 5 or 6 or 7%. So that's what's different. All right.
Okay.
Okay. So now you're going to be paying that loan off over 5 to 7 years. All right. Well, over 5 to 7 years, if the inflation rate is, and I'm going to go high, 10% per year, then the money you're paying with in the fourth and fifth year is a fraction of the value of what you got when you used that seller financing to buy that business. So you're letting inflation pay off a lot of the value of your business because it's going to be easier for you to make that money 7 years out from now than it is to make that amount of money today because your pricing will be different. Your margins may be the same, but if your prices are higher and your margins are the same, then you're making a whole lot more money that you can use to pay
Right.
off money down the road much easier than you can pay it off today. I mean, everybody understands in business the nature of inflation, but your question was, how is it an advantage to you? It's an advantage to you because what you want to do is find the lowest cost financing you can, push as much of it as you can out to as many years as you can, and let the value of the inflation pay. Now, I even structure my loan with two types of lenders. One is a mezzanine lender because they're very flexible on what they'll do with you with payments.
Right.
Okay. And then the seller. So instead of having a note with the seller, where, for example, I amortize a note over 7 years, I'll amortize it over 10 or 15 years with a balloon payment in 7. So what that does is it keeps my payments in these early years really low. And then as inflation is reducing this value of the dollars I'm paying with, I pay them with a balloon payment in the end, but I pay them with a low amortization schedule in the meantime. Right.
Right.
Or I structure the note so it even has more flexible payments than that. The first year I pay them as if it were amortized on a 15-year basis. And then that's my payment for that year. Then on my second year, I pay that as if it were amortized on a 12-year basis. And then on the next one, I pay it as if it were amortized on a 10-year basis. So now I've got really low payments the first year, a little bit bigger the second year, a little bit bigger the third year. And then I'm doing that until the end where I've now ratcheted it up, but I'm still making these payments that aren't as much as they normally would have been in an amortization with a big balloon payment at the end. So I'm figuring out creative ways to get high upfront payments as low as possible and
Right.
build the later years when inflated dollars make it easy for me to pay it off.